Okay, as bad as um Western civilization is in terms of genocide, oh, the the claim that Islam is not part of Western civilization just doesn't make any sense because um Platonic philosophy spread into the West um after the Dark Ages through Islamic philosophy in Spain, and of course the Cathars brought back Islamic philosophy also on the what do you call it, the spice, um and the um just the trade between Western Asia and China. I mean, essentially the civilization of Iran, um the it's now proven that Persia or Zoroastrianism was actually a big influence on the creation of Judaism. That's a proven fact now that the so-called burning bush that Moses saw actually was based on Zoroastrian religion. And so basic religion. And so basically, um, confronted with the end goal of patriarchy as civilization found worldwide the problem farming, enabling concentration of wealth, and then you have a culture of pederasty developing where the male elites become get ejaculation addiction and then focus on child rape and then cover it up as being that as being the basis of morality. So you have like this religious class, elite class that the males are claiming to be the epitome of morality when in fact they're practicing child rape and pederasty as ejaculation addiction. So this has been a problem worldwide since the development of agriculture. So you find it in like Papua New Guinea, you find it in Central America and the Nahawa culture, the people culture, and in it's like older than Aztec, but it's related to Aztec and anthropology. Professor Pete Siegel has written a number of books on the Nahua people culture in Central America being based on pederasty. And then, of course, he found that in ancient Greece, in Platonic philosophy, also the problem of pederasty being considered to be like moralistic the targeting of young males by the older males as being like the epitome of wisdom and philosophy or whatever, and the women hidden in their houses and controlled and all that. And the of course now apology we realized that the original human culture is based on all the males being required to do spiritual training as part of the hunter gatherer cult. And we can do the science has been able to reverse engineer the origin of humanity. And so modern human culture is hunter gatherers. They spread with bow and arrow hunting out of Africa like 70,000 years ago. And so they were very successful because they had this cooperative culture, and that's when they started to domesticate dogs. And so there's a book called the Survival of the Friendliest, because it argues that basically Modern humans are self-domesticated just like dogs are self-domesticated. And what's pretty interesting now is the ancient DNA science and archaeology is now proving that humans actually are much older, that the common ancestor of Denisovans and the common ancestor of Denisovans and Neanderthals and humans is like a million years old because they found the Homo longi, which is the dragon man in they found a similar skull that's a million years old, but it's actually a Denisovan, which proves that the origin of humans is actually, that created both humans and Denisovan is much older. And because previously it was thought that the common ancestor of Denisovans, Neanderthals, and modern humans was like 500,000 years old. And but what they have found is that there's this technology that was in 500,000. So the I don't remember how to pronounce it, but I did a blog post on it. But essentially, they use spears for hunting. Spearheads was chipping away the rocks a certain way that and then they'd use to that was wet, and then when it dry it would tighten the rock onto the spear, and then they would use pitch from tree sap to then um, protect the sinew from degrading, and that was the common hunting tool from 500,000 years ago for the early humans and also the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. And now, see, that's not the same as modern human culture. In other words, around 70,000 ago, there was this super volcano explosion, and that caused a global warming and very difficult to a like global warming and very difficult to survive. But certain parts of Africa were not as affected as much, and s- um, modern of healing is actually around 225,000 years ago because it's found in both the so-called pygmies or Biaka culture, that's like the short people in the Congo rainforest, and also these San Bushman hunter gatherers that also originated out of the equatorial rainforest, but they basically spread around Africa. And so, because they both rely on this musical healing spirit energy, the energy, that's a female energy and requires the men to be it for to develop that energy. Um, then they have a common culture that's 5,000 years old, and then that's what spread out of Africa 70,000 years ago. Years ago, that was a peaceful culture that relied on long distance hunting, but they used poison, so it was like mutually assured destruction because if you misbehaved, you could easily be there's no antidote to the poison. Um, so that really rarely happened because they were focused on like love energy for healing. And my view is that was originally the basis for what became developed into farming, but it was like they've now proven how animals first got domesticated was by the creation of these large rock like canals basically, or like funnel the animals into an enclosure where they could be hunted or domesticated. Tunnels were miles long, they were like 2 miles long, So the animals had no idea they were being funneled in to be domesticated. Kelly, like, however you pronounce it, Gobekli Kelly, Gobekli. Anyway, that so has been able to reverse engineer what it meant to be truly human, and also how that humanity and we um like chimpanzee, well, even like modern humans are worse than chimpanzee. So in terms of Professor R. Brian Ferguson proved in his book on war history and chimpanzees, basically what we view as warfare in chimpanzee culture is actually the humans engaging on the chimpanzees and degrading their natural environment. And then if we look at the bonobo culture, there it's all based on female bliss, and and even as modern this like they don't point out like the male not ejaculate other, even though they're very intimate, they ejaculate when they're with the female, for reproduction, and the females dominate the group. They provide violence by the males, and so you can see that this dynamic is millions old because essentially the female chimpanzees started making spears for hunting because they didn't want to be raped by the male chimpanzees, because the male chimpanzees would bring home meat and then they would demand they would rape the females to they presented the meat. And so the females were like, no, we're not having any of this, we're going to hunt on our own with spears. So you can see like the creation of technology, primates, and using walking, because we've been walking as hominins for 2 million years. mm, by 500,000 years ago as a global um, culture that probably arose out of Homo erectus, and then because they've proven now that like Homo erectus even used maritime travel, they made boats and stuff, and so um, so that but that was before we developed the um, culture and spiritual healing. The San Bushman pygmy culture is actually a later development, is though it's 225,000 years old. What it means to be human with spears um, for hunting is like 1 million years old, or at least 500,000 years old. Percent of Neanderthal DNA is actually from these older humans. So in other words, 6% of Neanderthals, their Neanderthals, their DNA is from with these older, and there's they're like 9% Denisovan or something. I mean, there's in other words, like in West Africa, there's a ghost archaic human that's was interbreeding with modern humans, I think up to like 50,000 years ago or something. I don't know. But the point is like there was like 7 or 8 different hominins walking around on 2 legs and probably interbreeding, um, and including like Homo erectus, which became like Homo floresiensis, which is like the hot human on the islands. It gives like Java or um and using these spears for hunting. And so, we've been around a while, but you can see like the development of other life on Earth, um, as ecological science is it's proving that our biological annihilation is much worse with abrupt global warming than the news is willing to consider. So most people just react to the news. So they basically do much research on their own. So, but if you do actually do the research and look into the science of ecological science and abrupt global warming, then you find out the situation is much, much worse than people realize. And it's like accelerating, so that, growing food at scale is going to be very difficult. They're already talking about it's not just a lack of fertilizer, but there's also the drought is much, much worse in the US this year. And there's already extreme heat in the Southwest and, record-breaking heat and got much bigger. So you get like extreme cold and you get extreme hot. And we had 50 degrees Fahrenheit in February in Minnesota, which is completely unheard of. But of course, the weather people are not going to focus on global warming. And they might mention it, but barely ever even mention it. They just say, "Oh, they just talk about the average temperature," and that I think they're basing on probably like 1980 is the from the foundation of what's average, which is kind of not really accurate. But anyway, so the the idea is like, oh well, we've adapted everywhere on Earth. They call this adapting, and now we need to leave Earth planets. Well, we really have not adapted. I mean, we adapted before agriculture. As humans, we spread around Earth like before the invention of agriculture, and then with the invention of all-based farming worldwide, that was no longer adaptation. That was basically like destroying the fertility of the land. And now, of course, we have water crisis because we're been mining the water and using it faster. So now the water is being the oceans. And, um, yeah, so this has been my whole life since I've been a teenager. This has been my focus has been on the ecological and environmental crisis. And um, I heard about the rainforest being cut down and the clear cutting of the forests, and um, they're trying to farming and all that. And um, what happens is you mess up the whole water cycle because the trees are what provide the rain, and you lose the soil fertility. And they're trying to do agriculture to increase the soil fertility and mimic what the prairies were like, where you had chase prey around. So they destroy the soil fertility. You can do that, but it's not um, at scale. It doesn't replace the domesticated animals that occurred for basically they overhunted Western Asia by 10,000 years ago, and then there's been archaeological sites now where they can literally measure like 2,000 years in succession and see how animals during hunter gatherers, and then they domesticated the sheep and the goats. And that's fascinating, actually. That's they just needed to supply chain, their protein was being changed from wild animals to domesticated animals. And so in order to maintain that level of protein, um in terms of animal domestication, it's not, it's too much damage.